The reading is taken from the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. To keep me from becoming conceited, because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is the word of the Lord. Be to God.
For when I am weak, then I am strong. Well, today at the start of the new year for Mothers Union, I want to talk about 2 people who discovered the truth of those words from Paul's letter. And the first, of course, is Paul himself. Paul was, and if you've read his letters, you'll understand, but Paul was a very strong, a very confident, a very self-assured person. He was also, at one time anyway, a committed and very zealous Pharisee. He's one of those people that, he doesn't do things by halves. He has to be full on, and he was a full-on Pharisee. And that was until he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He was on his way to arrest and prosecute some members of a new sect that has sprung up from nowhere and were growing quite substantially. And they claimed that their leader was not dead but alive, despite the fact that he'd been crucified by the Romans, and everybody knew that when the Romans killed a person, they usually stayed dead, because they knew how to kill people. That was one of their specialities. But on the road to finding these members of the sect, an unthinkable thing happened, and that is that Paul met this dead rabbi, Jesus. And not only was Jesus very much alive, he was very much unhappy with what Paul was doing, persecuting his followers. Anyway, as a result of that meeting, Paul did a complete about-face. He became a Christian. And instead of trying to crush Christianity, he ended up doing everything he could to promote it and traveling everywhere he could to do it. And as I said before, when Paul did something, he did it as fully as possible. Now, in many ways, Paul was exactly the same person as before. He was strong and self-assured and confident in his newfound faith. And what's more, he was blessed, as we heard in that reading, with some really amazing revelations of heaven, which he's just mentioned. But at the time of his writing, if you read down a little bit further, he apparently has become ill with a condition that was incurable. He refers to it as a thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan, he calls it. Something that made his life very difficult. We don't know what it was. It may have been poor eyesight. It may have been intestinal problems, or it may be, and this is probably the general consensus, some form of epilepsy. But either way, it left him weakened, and it slowed him down, and he couldn't quite reach the same levels that he had as a young man. And so this strong and energetic man suddenly came to realize his own frailness and weakness, and what's more, his mortality. And despite asking God to heal him many times, he hadn't. And instead, God said this to him: "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Or as Eugene Peterson puts it in his translation, the message, he says, "My grace is enough, it's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weakness." You know, I look at my children. The eldest is 42 now, and if you want to feel old, always think how old your oldest child is, 42. And they all, thank God, are fit and in good health. In fact, my eldest, at 42, hasn't long completed a 50-mile marathon. I think she's off her head, but there we are, she did it, and we're very proud of her. But one day, they will all discover that things inevitably deteriorate. Bolts start to come loose. Brickwork starts to flake. Things that once were firmly fixed in place will start to drop off at all kinds of moments, and cracks will appear in all kinds of awkward places. I'm talking in building analogies now, because not only is a builder, but next door they've just hacked off all the kind of the rendering of the front of the house to discover that there are huge cracks underneath, and they've had to rebuild some of the walls. So I just thought that's a good analogy. We're like that, we're all falling apart. That's what I'm saying. And they will discover, as Paul did, and we all have, that we are not indestructible, and the human body has a very definite use-by date marked on it. But those who are Christians know, as Paul did, that we are never alone, that God is with us and is there to help us through. Paul knew that, and from the confidence that comes from experience, he was able to write a little bit later on in the letter, "I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul discovered that these times, rather than being times to sort of mourn about or complain about, which we all do, were times actually when God's grace became even more vivid for him. And he discovered the reality of it when he didn't rely on his own strength, but he leant on God. And it was a marvelous discovery of him, and there he could talk in such terms. So that's Paul. Now, the second person who discovered this truth was Mary Sumner, the founder of the Mothers Union. She was born in 1828 as the third of 4 children. Her dad was a banker. Her mother was a very devout believer, a woman of strong faith. She married George Sumner, whose father was a bishop and a relative of the great reformer William Wilberforce. You remember him, of the slave trade, opposing the slave trade. And just before they were married, her husband-to-be, George, became a clergyman and was appointed vicar of Old Alresford in Hampshire. And there, Mary dedicated herself to motherhood, raising her children, and, of course, helping her husband with music for church and Bible classes. But when she gave birth to her eldest daughter in 1876, Mary started to reflect on how difficult it was to be a mother, what challenges there were, particularly in that era, I should imagine, with higher infant mortality rates and so on, and illnesses that didn't have any cures. And so she decided that she'd hold a meeting for mothers in her parish to offer mutual support and encouragement. Brilliant. But radically for the time, she made this open to all women, not just those of her class, but all women within the parish. If she found it hard with her resources and money, how much more difficult it would be for them who had little resources and even less money. And at the time, she became convinced also that, perhaps more radical today than then, that motherhood is every bit as important a profession as those of the men. In fact, I would argue it's even more, much more important. This is not really fashionable today, because women think that their highest profession was climbing up the ladder, breaking through the glass ceiling, doing all these kind of wonderful things, and they're great, but none of them are as great I believe, as motherhood. That's the pinnacle. If you can be a good mother, well, if you're not, the world will stop anyway, wouldn't it? So it's a very important profession. She realized that. But the first meeting that she held in, I think it was in the vicarage, didn't go well because Mary was so overcome by nervousness that she asked her husband to step in, and he led it and spoke at it. By the second meeting, she had got enough courage up to lead the meeting. She obviously prayed about it as well. And she was able to address and lead the meeting, and afterwards would hold regular meetings. But she always had that kind of slight nervousness and that about speaking. It was always a challenge. And things got harder. In 1885, she was part of an audience in a church congress in Portsmouth, some 20 miles away. And the Bishop of Newcastle, Ernest Wilberforce, had been asked to address the women churchgoers, but at the time felt that as a man he had very little to say to them. So I think he was very wise, didn't he, really? What have I got to say to women? And so he asked Mary to address them instead. And you can imagine how nervous she was. I mean, it's one thing, isn't it, in a vicarage room talking to women, or even in the church hall. But a congress? But again, after prayer, she stood up and apparently gave a passionate address about morality and about the importance of women's vocation as mothers and their ability by these two things to change the nation for the better. And this so inspired a number of women that were there that they went back to their parishes, started their own mothers' union in the same model as Mary, and of course we know the rest of the story. But here's the point. Both Paul and Mary had their different weaknesses in their lives, different challenges they faced, times when they felt they were not up to it, that they could not do it because of either a personal ailment or because of a lack of perhaps, a personal kind of confidence. Both discovered that their meager resources were not enough to meet the challenge they faced. But both of them, and this is the common they have, both believed in a God who was always with them, who had promised, I will never leave you or forsake you. And because of that, they were able to lean on God and discover the truth of the psalmist in Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength and a very present or an always present help in times of trouble. Psalm 46 verse 1. Now, if Paul knew that, and Mary Sumner knew that, and many others before and between and since, then why not you and I? It's the same God, the same Bible, the same promises, and let's be honest, the same weaknesses, the same needs. Nothing has changed. God certainly doesn't, and we don't. And so my prayer today, as the start of a new year, is that God will give you all his grace to believe in him, to hold firm to his promises, so that when you are weak, and we are all weak, then you will discover, perhaps more than ever, just how strong God is for us. Amen.